The knock came during the worst hour of the storm. 3 sharp raps that shouldn't have been audible over the wind, but were. Caleb Monroe set down his coffee cup. The fire hissed as snow blew down the chimney. He hadn't heard a human voice in 6 days, hadn't wanted to. The knocking came again, weaker this time. He crossed the cabin in 4 strides and pulled open the door. A woman collapsed across the threshold, an infant screaming in her arms. Both were covered in snow, their clothes stiff with ice. "No one wants me, sir." Her voice cracked like frozen leather. "But I can nurse the baby." Then her eyes rolled back and she went still. The child's cry cut through Caleb like a knife through cloth, high-pitched, desperate. The same sound that had filled this cabin 2 winters ago. Right before silence came forever. His hands shook as he lifted the woman. She weighed nothing. The baby thrashed against her chest, tiny fists striking air. "Easy now," he heard himself whisper. "Easy." He carried them both to the fire and laid them on the bearskin rug. The woman's lips were blue. The baby's face was red and furious with cold and hunger. Caleb's breath came short. He hadn't held an infant since the door stood open behind him. Snow poured in, white and endless. He stared at it for a long moment. One choice: close the door and let them stay, or carry them back out into the storm and let God sort it. The baby's cry weakened, started to sound like something drowning. Caleb turned back to them. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and pleading. "You're wanted here," he said, though his voice was rough as gravel. He closed the door slowly. The wind screamed once, then went muffled. The 3 of them were sealed together now, him, the woman, and the child who shouldn't have lived long enough to reach his cabin. He knelt beside them, hands hovering uselessly over strangers he'd just pulled across a threshold he swore he'd never cross again. She woke to silence the kind that follows violence or miracle, and couldn't remember which this was. Gray light filtered through frost-covered windows. The smell of coffee and wood smoke. A blanket tucked around her shoulders that she didn't remember pulling up herself. The baby. Sarah bolted upright, panic flooding her chest. Grace was gone. No. There, in a wooden crate lined with soft flannel. Sleeping. Clean. Warm. Breathing. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her daughter. Grace stirred but didn't wake. Someone had changed her, wrapped her properly, fed her somehow. The cabin door opened. The man from last night stepped inside, carrying an armload of firewood. He didn't look at her. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Milk too, if the baby needs it." He stacked the wood with mechanical precision. His movements were careful, controlled, like a man who'd forgotten how to be loose in his own skin. "Thank you." Sarah's voice came out small. "I'll work. I can cook, mend, clean. Whatever you need. I won't be a burden." He finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue. Distant, but not unkind. "You got a name?" "Sarah. Sarah Brennan." She hesitated. "This is Grace." He nodded once. "Caleb Monroe." Before either of them could say more, hoofbeats sounded outside. Caleb moved to the window, jaw tightening. An older man dismounted from a gray horse, moving stiffly through the snow. He knocked twice, then opened the door without waiting for an answer. Caleb. He stopped when he saw Sarah. His eyes went from her to the baby to Caleb. "Hell, Moses." Caleb's voice was flat. Moses pulled off his hat, snow falling from the brim. He was maybe 60, with a weathered face that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. But his expression was grim. "Town's looking for her," Moses said quietly. "Deacon Pritchard's got the church ladies stirred up. Says she stole provisions. Some are saying worse." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd known they'd come looking. Hadn't known it would be this fast. Moses studied Caleb's face for a long moment. You keeping her? She's under my roof. Caleb's voice was steel wrapped in calm. That's all anyone needs to know. Moses sighed. Looked at Sarah with something that might have been pity. Then you're choosing a hard road, son. I know what turning her out means. Moses nodded slowly, put his hat back on. I'll keep my ears open. But Pritchard's got influence, and a mean streak when he thinks God's on his side. He left without another word. Sarah watched through the window as Caleb walked Moses to his horse. They spoke in low voices she couldn't hear. Then Moses rode away, shaking his head. Caleb returned to splitting wood, his axe falling in steady, furious rhythm. Sarah looked past him to the small grave marker beyond the barn. A wooden cross, half buried in snow, no name visible from this distance. She didn't ask, but she understood. This man knew what loss tasted like. And he'd just invited more of it through his door. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words all day. But silence in the cabin felt different now, occupied instead of empty. Evening came cold and blue. Grace slept in the makeshift cradle. Sarah stirred a pot of stew, trying to make herself useful without being intrusive. Caleb sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that caught the firelight. His hands moved with unconscious skill. I didn't steal anything, Sarah said quietly. He didn't look up. Didn't figure you did. The merchant's son, Benjamin Walters. Her voice was flat now, telling it like a story that happened to someone else. He said he'd marry me. Said we'd go to California together. Start fresh. Caleb's knife paused for half a second, then continued. When I told him about the baby, he was gone by morning. Left me with $30 and a note that said he'd made a mistake. She laughed, but it had no humor in it. The church women called me Jezebel. Said I'd tempted him. That I was unfit to raise a child in God's sight. So you ran. So I ran. Sarah wiped her eyes roughly. I didn't know where else to go. I saw your light. Caleb set down the knife and the half-carved piece of wood. For a long moment he just stared at the fire. My wife was named Elizabeth, he said finally. Our daughter was Anna. Fever took them both 2 winters back. 3 days from first symptom to... He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's chest tightened. I'm sorry. Built that cradle for nothing. His voice was hollow. Swore I'd never hold another child. Swore I'd never let anyone close enough to... He stopped. Shook his head. Outside. Horses approached, 3 of them. Caleb stood smoothly, picking up the rifle that leaned against the wall. He checked the chamber with practiced ease, then walked to the door. Sarah scooped Grace into her arms, heart hammering. 3 men dismounted in the snow. The one in front wore a long black coat and a preacher's collar. His face was thin and sharp, eyes like a hawk's. Deacon Pritchard, Caleb said from the porch. His voice carried clear and cold. Caleb Monroe. Pritchard's smile didn't reach his eyes. We've come for the woman. She needs to answer for her sins. She's committed no crime in my house. Harboring sinners makes you one, Caleb. Pritchard's smile widened. Mighty fall from grace for a man who used to sit in the front pew every Sunday. Grace is sleeping inside. Caleb's rifle stayed pointed at the ground, but his finger rested near the trigger. She's the only innocent one in this conversation. The sheriff, a tired-looking man with a gray mustache, shifted uncomfortably. Caleb, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You want her. You come through me. Pritchard's eyes glittered. We'll be watching. And when you fall, and you will, we'll be there to remind this county what happens to men who forget their place. He turned his horse sharply. The other 2 followed. Sarah stood in the doorway now. Grace clutched to her chest. The baby reached out suddenly, tiny fingers grasping for Caleb's hand. He looked down. His calloused finger was caught in Grace's grip, small, impossibly strong, alive. He didn't pull away. They'll come back, Sarah whispered, I know. Caleb's jaw was set. But not tonight. He stepped inside and closed the door. The three of them stood together in the firelight, strangers bound by something that had no name yet, but felt. Like the beginning of something that could either save them or destroy them both. Routine became their language when words felt too dangerous. March arrived with false promises of spring. Snow melted in patches, revealing mud and dead grass. The days stretched longer. Light lasted past supper now. Sarah scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, washing windows Caleb hadn't touched in 2 years. Mending shirts with holes worn through the elbows. Organizing the chaos of a man who'd stopped caring about order. Caleb taught her to shoot. "Hold it firm," he said, adjusting her grip on the rifle. "But don't fight it. Let it be part of you." She fired. The recoil knocked her back a step. But the tin can on the fence post flew backward. Again. By the end of the week, she could hit the can 3 times out of 5. Caleb didn't smile, but something in his posture relaxed. "You're a quick study." "I've had to be." They worked side by side without touching. Sarah cooked. Caleb repaired fences. Grace grew stronger, her cries less desperate, more curious. Moses visited on Sunday with news from town. "Pritchard's telling anyone who'll listen that you two are living in sin." Moses poured himself coffee, leaning against the counter. "Says the baby might even be yours. Caleb. That you've been hiding her all along." Sarah's face went hot with shame. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Let him talk. Talk turns into action out here," Moses warned. "Widow Hastings won't look at you in the general store anymore. The church ladies cross the street when they see Sarah's name mentioned." "I don't need their approval. You need their business. Winter's coming again. You can't survive on pride." Caleb said nothing. But that night, Sarah heard movement downstairs. She climbed down from the loft and found him in the corner, working by lamplight. The old cradle. The one he'd built for Anna. He was sanding it smooth, replacing a broken rocker, oiling the joints. His hands moved with reverence, touching wood the way other men touched holy things. Sarah watched from the shadows. He didn't know she was there, or maybe he did, and it didn't matter anymore. When he finally put down his tools and went to bed, Sarah crossed to the cradle. She ran her fingers over the carved headboard, delicate flowers, and a name half-finished. Anna. She didn't move it, didn't touch it again. But the next morning, Grace was sleeping in it. That evening, Sarah sang while washing dishes, an old lullaby her mother used to hum. She didn't realize Caleb had come inside until his voice joined hers on the second verse, low, rough, but unmistakably there. They finished the song together. Neither of them spoke afterward. But something had shifted like ice cracking on a river in spring. Grace's breathing changed, first shallow, rapid, wrong. Sarah woke to it in the dead of night. Her daughter's skin was burning. The baby's eyes rolled, unfocused and glassy. Caleb. Sarah's voice cracked with terror. He was beside her in seconds, barefoot and half-dressed. One look at Grace and his face went pale. Fever. The word came out hoarse. They worked through the night. Cold compresses soaked in creek water. Herbal tea Moses had taught him to brew willow bark and elderflower. Sarah held Grace against her chest, trying to will her own strength into the tiny body. But Grace kept burning. Caleb paced like a caged animal. His hands shook as he wrung out another cloth. It's too fast. Fever shouldn't spike this quick. What do we do? I don't know. The admission seemed to break something in him. Last time I didn't know either. Last time I... His voice shattered. Sarah looked up and saw tears on his face. Raw. Helpless. The mask of control he wore every day had cracked wide open. Not again. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. God, not again, please. Sarah stood, still holding Grace. She crossed to him and pressed her free hand against his chest. Look at me. He did. His eyes were wild. "She's not Anna," Sarah said firmly. "And this isn't 2 years ago. We're here. We're fighting. Don't leave me now." Something in her voice steadied him. He sucked in a breath, nodded once, and went back to work. They didn't speak for hours. Just moved in rhythm water, compress, prayer, repeat. Dawn came gray and hesitant. Grace's breathing evened out. The fever broke. Color returned to her cheeks. Sarah collapsed into a chair, shaking with exhaustion. Caleb sat on the floor beside her, head in his hands. "You loved her so much," Sarah whispered. "Your daughter. I'm scared to love again." His voice was raw. "Scared to lose again." Sarah reached down and touched his hair. "Love isn't the danger. Loneliness is." He looked up at her. Something passed between them, understanding. Maybe, or recognition that they were both haunted by the same ghosts. Grace stirred in Sarah's arms and made a soft, contented sound. The door burst open. Moses stood on the threshold, breathing hard. "Pritchard's petitioning the territorial judge," he said without preamble. "Says you're unfit guardians. Wants Grace taken and placed with a proper Christian family." The peace shattered like glass. Sarah's arms tightened around her daughter. "No. He's got influence," Moses said grimly. "And the judge owes him favors. This isn't just talk anymore." Caleb stood slowly. His face was stone again. But his eyes were different now, not distant, but burning. When? Hearing set for Sunday. 4 days. 4 days to lose everything. She'd never felt so visible and so invisible at once. The Redemption Fork Church was packed, every pew full. Women in their Sunday best, men in clean shirts and judgment on their faces. Sarah sat in the front row, Grace clutched to her chest, Caleb beside her. Spine straight, jaw set. Deacon Pritchard stood at the pulpit like he was delivering a sermon instead of presiding over a trial. "We are here," he began, "to determine the moral fitness of Sarah Brennan and whether Caleb Monroe, a respected man of this community, has been led astray by sin." Sarah's stomach churned. Grace fussed, sensing her mother's fear. The testimonies began, one by one. The church women stood and spoke. "She came to town with no husband and no shame," said Mrs. Dalton. "She bewitched that poor man," added Mrs. Cooper. "Exploited his grief. The child deserves better than a harlot for a mother." Each word was a knife. Sarah kept her eyes down, heat flooding her face. Then Caleb stood. The room went silent. "I've known more God in that cabin these past weeks than I've felt in this church my whole life," he said. His voice was steady, but fury simmered beneath it. "Sarah Brennan has shown courage. She's shown love. She's worked harder than anyone here to build a life worth living." He turned to look at the assembled crowd. "What have you shown judgment cruelty? Is that the Christianity you preach?" Murmurs rippled through the pews. Pritchard's smile was thin. "Noble words, Caleb, but we have one more witness." Sarah's heart sank. Widow Hastings stood. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes or so, Sarah had thought when they'd met briefly at the general store. "I've known Caleb Monroe for 15 years. Widow Hastings began. "Watched him mourn his wife and child. And I believe," she paused, "I believe this woman saw his grief and used it. Lured him into sin with a child that isn't his. It's manipulation dressed up as need." The room erupted in agreement. Sarah felt something inside her crumble. She'd expected cruelty from strangers, but this betrayal from a woman who'd seemed kind cut deeper. Caleb's face went white with rage. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Pritchard's voice was silk over steel. "Can you honestly say she hasn't benefited from your protection, that you haven't compromised yourself for her?" Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. The truth was complicated, and complicated truths didn't survive in rooms like this. The council voted quickly. 7-2. Sarah Brennan must leave Redemption Fork County within 1 week. Pritchard announced, Grace will be evaluated for placement with a suitable family. Sarah couldn't breathe. The words didn't make sense. Couldn't be real. Caleb grabbed her arm. We're leaving. They pushed through the crowd. No one met Sarah's eyes. Even the few sympathetic faces looked away. The ride home was silent. Sarah stared at the frozen landscape, already planning to vanish before she destroyed Caleb any further. Caleb gripped the reins so hard his knuckles went white. Rage and helplessness choked him. They sat 3 feet apart on the wagon seat. It felt like miles. She wrote the note by candlelight. Each word, a small death. Caleb, thank you for seeing me as wanted. I won't let them destroy you. Don't look for us. Sarah. She packed quietly. Grace slept in the cradle, unaware that her world was about to shatter again. Sarah looked around the cabin one last time. This place had felt more like home in 6 weeks than anywhere she'd lived in years. But home wasn't hers to keep. She slipped out the door just before dawn. Caleb woke to silence. Knew immediately something was wrong. The cradle was empty. Sarah's few belongings gone. The note sat on the table, weighted down by a smooth river stone. He read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist. Something inside him broke. Not grief this time. Fury. Fury at himself for not fighting harder, for letting shame silence him when he should have roared. He saddled his horse and rode hard to the graveyard. Elizabeth's grave was simple. A wooden cross with her name and Anna's carved below it. Wildflowers frozen now scattered around the base. Caleb dismounted and stood before the grave. I loved you, he said aloud. I still do. You were everything to me. His voice cracked. But there's a woman and a baby who need me now. And I think you'd want me to live again. Not just survive. Live. The wind blew cold across the headstones. Give me permission to let go. Please. No answer came. But something in his chest loosened a knot he'd carried for 2 years, finally unraveling. He mounted his horse and rode hard toward the main road. Moses found Sarah 3 miles out. Where you headed? He called. She didn't stop walking. Anywhere that isn't here. Moses rode up beside her. That man went to hell and back for you last night. You running now proves Pritchard right that you're weak. Are you? Sarah stopped, turned to face him. I'm saving him. From what living Moses's voice was sharp. Caleb Monroe's been dead for 2 years. You're the first thing that made him feel alive, and you're just going to walk away. The town will destroy him. The town already tried. He chose you anyway. Moses leaned down. Courage isn't staying when it's easy. It's staying when it's hell. Now get on this horse before I drag you. Sarah looked back down the road, then up at Moses. He doesn't need saving, Moses said quietly. He needs someone to fight beside. Sarah climbed onto the horse when Sarah crested the hill. Caleb was waiting on the porch, rifle oiled, posture resolute, eyes burning. We face them together, he said, as a family. Sarah dismounted slowly. Grace stirred in her arms. I don't want to ruin you. Too late. I'm already ruined. Caleb's voice was rough. But I'd rather be ruined with you than dead alone. At the base of the grave marker, the first wildflowers were pushing through the melting snow tiny. Stubborn. Alive. Spring was coming whether the world was ready or not. They came at noon, when shadows were shortest and truth had nowhere to hide. Deacon Pritchard arrived with Judge Wainwright, Sheriff Dunn, and half the town as witnesses. Wagons lined the road. People stood in clusters, whispering. Sarah stood beside Caleb on the porch, Grace in her arms. Moses flanked them on the right. Pritchard dismounted with theatrical slowness. I've brought the judge to settle this matter once and for all. Judge Wainwright was a weary-looking man in his 60s. He'd seen too many frontier disputes settled with blood instead of law. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Mr. Monroe, Miss Brennan?" He tipped his hat. "I've heard much about this situation. Deacon Pritchard claims the child should be removed for her own welfare." "We have documentation," Moses said. Stepping forward, he handed over a sheaf of papers. "Formal guardianship arrangement. Character testimonies from neighboring ranchers who vouch for Caleb Monroe's integrity." The judge read slowly. Pritchard's smile was tight. "Those papers are forged. Monroe's not in his right mind. This woman has— I'll marry her." Caleb interrupted. The crowd went silent. "Right now. Today. If that's what satisfies your twisted sense of decency." Caleb's voice was steel. "Judge her if you want, but I'm the one who invited her in. I'm the one who'll stand with her. So judge me first." Sarah's breath caught. She turned to him. "Caleb, I don't need marriage to validate my worth," Sarah said, her voice clear and carrying across the yard. "I've been told my whole life I'm worthless without a man's name, that I'm nothing but shame." She stepped forward. Grace held close. "But this man, Caleb Monroe, he's the only one who saw me as human. Not a scandal. Not a problem to solve. Human." Her voice shook, but didn't break. "If I marry him, it's because I choose him, because he showed me what love actually looks like. Not your rules, not your judgment. Love." The crowd murmured. Some faces softened, others hardened. Judge Wainwright looked from Sarah to Caleb to Pritchard, then down at the papers in his hand. "I've seen enough," he said finally. "The child stays with her mother. Mr. Monroe's character is beyond reproach, and these guardianship papers are legal and binding." Pritchard's face went red. "This is an outrage. This hearing is closed." The judge's voice cut like a blade. "And frankly, Deacon, you should be ashamed. I've seen a lot of frontier justice twisted by spite. This was one of the ugliest." He handed the papers back to Moses and turned to leave. Pritchard stood frozen, fury radiating off him like heat. "This isn't over." "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." Pritchard stormed to his horse. A few townspeople followed. But many stayed behind, faces uncertain. Widow Hastings approached slowly, hat in her hands. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Caleb nodded once. Sarah said nothing. Forgiveness would take time she wasn't ready to give. Grace reached out, tiny fingers grasping at a wildflower growing beside the porch. It came loose in her hand, a small, perfect bloom of spring yellow. Moses grinned. "Well, hell. We won." Sarah leaned into Caleb's side. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders. The people began to leave. Some still whispering, but some, just a few, nodded respectfully as they passed. Spring had arrived, and for the first time in 2 years, the world felt possible again. The cabin looked different now, lived in instead of haunted. May came in warm and gentle. Wildflowers carpeted the clearing in waves of yellow, purple, and white. Birds nested in the eaves. Sarah's garden thrived rows of beans, squash, and herbs reaching toward the sun. The wedding was simple. Moses officiated, reading from a worn Bible. Grace cooed in Sarah's arms. One tiny hand wrapped around a ribbon tied to her mother's dress. No church. No crowd. Just 3 witnesses who mattered: Moses, a neighboring rancher named Thomas, and Thomas's wife Mary, who brought a quilt as a gift. "Do you, Caleb Monroe, take this woman?" "I do." Caleb's voice was steady. "And do you, Sarah Brennan?" "I do," Moses smiled. "Then I pronounce you married." "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb leaned in slowly, giving Sarah time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. The kiss was gentle, brief, but it carried the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. Grace squealed happily, as if she understood. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt like peace. A few townspeople came to apologize, some genuine, some awkward. All accepted with grace, if not complete forgiveness. Widow Hastings brought preserves and a rocking chair. "I was cruel," she said simply. "Fear makes us cruel. I'm sorry." Sarah thanked her but didn't invite her inside. Trust had to be earned back slowly. Caleb built in addition to the cabin a small room for Grace, with windows facing east to catch the morning light. Sarah sewed curtains from fabric Moses brought from town. They worked side by side, not like strangers anymore, like people who'd chosen each other deliberately. One evening, as the sun set gold and orange across the meadow, Caleb and Sarah stood in the doorway, the same threshold where she'd collapsed 6 months ago. Grace was taking her first wobbly steps through the wildflowers, laughing each time she stumbled and caught herself. "She'll grow up knowing she was always wanted," Caleb said quietly. Sarah leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "We all were." In the distance, beyond the meadow, the small grave marker stood, no longer isolated, part of a landscape that held both loss and life, grief and joy, ending and beginning. The past didn't vanish. It never did. But it had stopped being the only story worth telling. Grace squealed and ran well, toddled quickly toward them, arms outstretched. Caleb scooped her up, and she grabbed his nose with both hands. Giggling, Sarah laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came from deep in the chest where hope lived. The three of them stood together in the doorway as the sun sank lower. Smoke rose from the chimney. The garden grew. The wildflowers bent in the evening breeze. Some families were born. Others were built log by log, choice by choice, through the hardest winters into the kindest spring. And this one, forged in storm and judgment and stubborn love, was theirs.